of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Inherited sin for a few generations. Thomas Paine, incidentally, in his The Rights of Man, I'm going to come back to Paine, he protested that this is contrary to every principle of moral justice, and I would agree. Okay, in the New Testament, God is supposed to have sent his only Son to save and redeem from sin not only his chosen people, but all people. Well, isn't that the prophet of universal human rights? The hope vanishes, though, when we look at the New Testament for a number of reasons. You get the idea of predestination in the New Testament. Again, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, compares human beings to pots, and God is the pot maker. And he says the pot maker, has the right to make out of a lump of clay, quote, one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor. Just as an aside, think of a flower pot and a piss pot. Right? Two radically different pots for different purposes. And he says, so too do we not have the right to complain to God? Why hast thou made me thus? And of course, Jesus threatens eternal hellfire for non-believers, etc., etc. Right? Can't see universal human rights there. And there's a number of problems when anyone tries to do that sort of thing. The sad fact, I would say, is that we don't start clearly seeing universal human rights talk until the European Enlightenment. John Locke in particular, late 1600s, we start seeing talk about natural, innate human rights. In the second of his two treatises of government, 1690, he says humans are in a state of equality. He says all mankind, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, and possessions. Why? For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, which is God, all are his property. Right? In the state of nature, he says, this is without civilization, without government, without anything. In a state of nature, he says, we have the right to punish violators. God put into every human being the right to punish a murderer, for example, to kill a murderer. Right? The basic human rights that Locke talks about are life, liberty, and property, a very popular idea, life, liberty, and property. He says God created all humans, and he created them all with the same rights. We're all Adam's children. And we all have an equal right to the use of the inferior creatures, animals. And it goes on and on and on. Thomas Jefferson, again, wrote the Declaration of Independence. It's interesting to look at his letters. In one letter, he names what he thinks are the three greatest people in history. One is Newton. I can't remember who the other one was, I didn't write it down. And the remaining one is Locke. And of the three, Locke is the only one who wrote on morality. And for Jefferson, Locke laid the superstructure, his word, of the moral sciences. The influence of Locke on Jefferson was enormous. Very enormous. Okay, now some people don't like, actually many people don't like the idea that the concept of universal human rights began with one particular culture in one part of the world at one particular time, right? 17th century Europe, more specifically England. Most people, or many people at least, want to believe that other cultures too independently discovered the truth of universal human rights. Discovered, not invented, discovered. There are a number of problems with that view. One is known as presentism. reading the present into the past. Now when one looks at claims, I'm going to go through a number, when one looks at claims of, well, it wasn't just the European Enlightenment that had the idea, other cultures had it too. One finds presentism, reading the present into the past, projecting the present into the past. This is typically combined with wishful thinking, which one also could call the ought-is fallacy. Right? They ought to have had it, they ought to have had it, therefore they did have it. Right? This is often combined with ethnocentrism, puffing up one's own ethnic group, historically, let's say. And another common danger and mistake is what's called gerrymandering, picking and choosing those passages that fit one's view and ignoring the ones that do not. Now, here's a simple anecdote of this sort of thing happening. I taught these ideas very briefly in an ethics class maybe a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I don't know. It was pretty recently. After the class, I had 3 students come up to me, very polite, 3 Persian students, very polite. But they said to me, have you heard of Cyrus the Great? And I said, heard of him? Have you read him? Have you read The Cylinder? And I said, no. And they said, well, Cyrus the Great was actually the first to enunciate universal human rights. I said, come on, really? He said, yes. I said, okay, I've got to do some research. One of the beautiful things about teaching is that teaching is learning. I have no problem with students challenging me on ideas like that, or other ideas. And so, did some research. Found a number of websites that had translations of the Cylinder, of the proclamations of Cyrus the Great. One in particular was by a political activist in Iran. And she claims Cyrus the Great was, quote, the first messenger of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right? Now this is, we're talking 539 BC. So I read a number of translations of the Cylinder. Cyrus was indeed great. He was well ahead of his time. When he became the emperor, he said he will not let anybody oppress others. And he will take his or her, he's giving rights, and he says, I'll take it back and penalize the oppressors. Well, think about it. That's the language of conventional rights. I'm giving you the rights. You violate it, I'll take the rights back. That's not human rights. It's not innate rights. That's conventional rights. He also gives people the freedom to choose a religion. He also is against slavery. And again, he will punish people, take away rights of people who violate his proclamations. He was great when we think about what he gave to his people. But to read into that, the first, with the words again, the first messenger of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is presentism, ethnocentrism, gerrymandering, possibly, and wishful thinking. Right? A lot of that goes on in the literature on human rights. Another example is, well, one could multiply examples. The edicts of Ashoka the Great, who was an East Indian emperor, bloody, ruthless, converted to Buddhism. His proclamations are then recorded on stone pillars, lots of them. Another example is the Quran. Doing some research recently, I found a professor of religious studies at the University of Louisville who claims, quote, the Quran is the Magna Carta of human rights. Right? I thought that's interesting. That's 1996. He's wrong on 2 counts. First of all, the